Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. My name is Michael Meadows. I'm actually now the immediate past president of the IGU. We had our General Assembly last week in Dublin. But I am chair of the GeoUnions, which is a group of so-called Category 1 members of the International Science Council. And we've established, or re-established, I should say, a distinguished lecture series that we started a couple of years ago in relation to the International Year of Basic Sciences for Sustainable Development. That has now evolved into the International Decade announced by the United Nations in August last year. And in honor of that, we've decided to relaunch the lecture series, and this is the first of them today. So wherever you're joining us from, I'm in Nanjing in China, and it's 9 p.m. in the evening. But I know that some of you will be perhaps in the Americas or in Europe, or perhaps even further east than I am. So good day, good afternoon, good evening, or even good morning to all of you. Our presenter today is Professor Ferdinando Boero, who is a marine biologist. He's been a prolific scientist. He's been publishing scientific articles and book chapters and so on since 1976. But he's also been a significant player in terms of scientific policy. He has, for example, offered policy advice to the Mediterranean Commission, the European Marine Board, the European Network of Excellence, and organizations of that sort. He told me that he has a particular interest, of course, in marine biology, but especially in dealing with biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, and where the disciplines come together to explain some of those processes. He also, I know that he's particularly interested in scientific communication. So I think he is an ideal person to kick off our new series. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ferdinando, who will share his screen with us and make a presentation, which I think will be around about 45 minutes or so long. We don't have a clock on him. You will be able to ask questions in the Q&A at any time. Obviously, we'll only answer those at the end of the presentation. And we'll allow something like half an hour or 40 minutes at the end of the lecture to have a discussion. So thanks very much for your attendance. This lecture is being recorded and will be available on the GeoUnions website and probably on the ISC website after a couple of days when we can get it up there. So thanks a lot. Ferdinando, over to you.
Hey, thank you, Michael. Can you see the screen?
We can see the screen perfectly. Thank you.
Very good. So the title is Knowledge About How the Living World Function is the Premise of Sustainability. And here is the world in a rather skewed representation. The ocean covers the 71% of the planet, but the ocean is not a surface. The ocean is a volume, and it represents more than 90% of the life-inhabited space. So if we want to understand how the world works, we need to know to understand the ocean. And here you can see the Great Ocean Conveyor that connects all the oceans into a single grand system. And the functioning of the Great Ocean Conveyor derives from deep water formation at the poles. So the cold waters below the sea ice tend to sink for thermohaline currents. They go across the Atlantic, they reach the Antarctic, they go around the Antarctic, one branch goes into the Indian Ocean, the other branch goes into the Pacific Ocean. The water comes to the surface, makes the tour of the world, and then it rejoins with the Gulf Current, the closing of the Great Ocean Conveyor. Why it is important, besides connecting the all the basins, because the majority of the space inhabited by life is in the dark. And if it's in the dark, there is no photosynthesis. And if there is no photosynthesis and there are only animals, they consume oxygen. So the surface waters rich in oxygen go, thanks to the deep water formation near the surface, go in the deep and make life possible, at least for breathing, even in the deepest parts of the world ocean. In the water column, and so in this big volume, we see mostly carnivores. Here you can see the animals that usually are shown in documentaries. The white shark eats the tuna eats the mackerel eats the anchovy or the sardines. They are all carnivores. Where are the herbivores? Where are the primary producers? There are algae and seagrasses on the coast, but they are almost irrelevant for the functioning of oceanic ecosystems. They are too far from the greatest majority of the space inhabited by life. The plants are microscopic unicellular algae that you can see here, especially diatoms and dinoflagellates. And so these are the primary producers, and they are invisible to us. On land, we are used to define habitats according to the vegetation. But in the water column and the ocean space, this is not the case. These unicellular organisms are eaten by small crustaceans that are the herbivores. For instance, copepods. So here are the grass and the herbivores. If you think about the large fish and even the small ones, they start their life cycle as tiny eggs that then become embryos and then larvae and then juveniles. Then they grow and start to eat each other. But when they are young, all these fish feed on copepods. So without copepods and other planktons like the copepods, the larger organisms cannot be present. We are used so to see carnivore-dominated ecosystems that function thanks to microscopic organisms that we do not perceive properly. All these organisms die, and they are decomposed by bacteria. The decomposition leads to the nutrient formation, and so the circle is closed. What happens in the dark? In the dark, the oxygen can arrive in the way that I showed before, thanks to downwelling currents, but then animals cannot only breathe, they have to eat. And the food arrives as marine snow from what is present on the surface, and the dead materials and the rejects of the organisms that live in the euphotic zone are the food for detritus feeders that then feed the larger organisms of the food webs in the deep sea. Even the carcasses of large cetaceans fall to the sea bottom and they become food for scavengers. So if you put all the things together, this is how most of the living world works, and these are the relationships among the organisms. Some of the things shown here are not so intuitive. For instance, the greatest predators, even of large fish, are jellyfish because they feed on their eggs and larvae. So the mortality, for instance, of tuna might be higher due to predation on the tuna larvae and juveniles and eggs by jellyfish than by white sharks. So the intricacy of food webs is very great. In other words, we can say that the microbial core that you see at the center of this illustration with bacteria and diatoms and dinoflagellates and some protozoans is the origin of four main pathways that lead to the functioning of ecosystems. One is the microbial pathway, and so the microbes can become dominant, as it happens with the harmful algal blooms and red tides dominated by dinoflagellates. But the pathway that we like the most is the herbivorous plankton fish pathway that leads even to us. Other two pathways are the herbivorous gelatinous plankton, and you can see pelagic tunicates that tap microbes from the water column competing with the crustaceans that feed on the same food. And then there is the carnivorous gelatinous plankton like jellyfish and ctenophores that feed on both zooplankton and the fish eggs and larvae. Besides these pathways, we can recognize in the functioning of ecosystems three fluxes that are usually considered as parts of a single ecosystem, of a single system, but that are not so much connected with each other. One is the extra-specific fluxes, so matter that is not living and organized as a species, and they are called biogeochemical cycles. And there is a branch of ecology that studies biogeochemical cycles. Then there are life cycles, and these are intraspecific fluxes because species can persist if matter flows from one generation to the next, thanks to reproduction. And then there are the interspecific fluxes that are usually called trophic networks, in which matter flows from one species to another species. So the beginning of these representations shows biogeochemical cycles, matter split into its elemental constituents that is assembled by primary producers. And these are plants, protists, and bacteria. And they persist thanks to life cycles. Then, from primary producers, matter flows through food webs to secondary producers, the herbivores. The animals that, or the protists, who feed on the primary producers decompose them into their guts and then synthesize them into the matter that makes up their bodies. So there is zoodecomposition, which usually occurs in the guts thanks to symbiotic bacteria, and then there is zoosynthesis. The secondary producers, the herbivores, can be eaten by tertiary producers, which are the carnivores of herbivores, but things can go on further on to higher trophic level because there are predators of predators of predators in marine food webs, which are very complex. Eventually, everything dies, and so you see the flow of matter that goes to the decomposers. The decomposers can be eaten by secondary producers, but usually lead to mineralization of the substances that enter the biogeochemical cycles. The microbes, bacteria especially, can be killed by viruses via the viral shunt, which contributes to biogeochemical cycles by the decomposition of decomposers. So here in this scheme, you see these three fluxes that usually are dealt with by different approaches in one shot. This is a black box approach, but we can open the boxes and see what's in the boxes. And so we can start to deal with organisms, that is, with biodiversity. And let's try to make the three fluxes explicit, even if the way I'm showing them is simplified. So you have the plankton, nekton, and benthos with the corpses and the wastes that are decomposed by the decomposers, and then the nutrients are formed. You can see it on the left. Then there are the primary producers, the phytoplankton, the diatoms, the dinoflagellates. These guys can be holoplanktonic, so spend their whole life in the plankton, but they can also be pelagobenthic. This means that these forms that are as functional adults, let's call them, are in the plankton, can spend long periods in the sediments as resting stages. And here they are part of what we call the meiofauna. And the meiofauna is represented by, here you see a loriciferan. Many of these guys have piercing mouth parts and sucking pharynxes. And they might control in the sediments the diversity of plankton by eating the resting stages of the pelagobenthic representatives of the phytoplankton. The biogeochemical explanation of plankton pulses, the pulse of phytoplankton and then zooplankton, can be understood only, especially in coastal systems, only if we consider also the resting stage banks that are present in the sediments. And so this links the plankton and the benthos through the life cycles of the species that represent these compartments that are not separated from each other, but that are united, linked by these processes. The phytoplankton can be eaten, and also the bacteria can be eaten by benthic filter feeders like sponges, mollusks, and so on. And so there is a trophic link with this compartment of the marine systems. Then there are the herbivores. And so we can have gelatinous herbivorous zooplankton, the pathway of the tunicates, for instance, on top. And then there is the herbivorous zooplankton made of crustaceans. Some can be holoplanktonic and so spend their whole life in the plankton, but many, especially on the coast, are pelagobenthic and they have resting stages. At this point, you can see that the plankton and the benthos are strictly connected with each other. And very often, the people who study the plankton don't study the benthos and vice versa. The plankton is also made of the larvae of the benthic organisms. And so we can have holobenthos, the benthic organisms that do not have planktonic larvae, and bentoplankton, the benthic organisms that have pelagic planktonic larvae. This is further complicated by carnivorous zooplankton, like the arrow worms that you see on top here, or by gelatinous carnivorous zooplankton. The jellyfish can be holoplanktonic, but many are pelagobenthic. So there are polyps that produce the jellyfish. If you have a jellyfish bloom, usually the jellyfish come from the benthos. And these guys can feed on the larvae and the crustaceans of the fish, as we see later, and on the crustaceans that we saw before. And then there is the nekton. The nekton is made of holonekton, like the cetaceans, but usually it's nectoplankton, especially the fish. They have complex life cycles with planktonic larvae that then grow and become the nekton. And here you have the tangle of the relationships among the different components of the living world in 90% of the space inhabited by life. Each portion of this scheme is studied by different disciplines and different people, and the interactions with each other are seldom taken into account. I started my career by studying jellyfish, and I studied especially the benthic stages of the jellyfish. Then I passed to the planktonic stages, and then I started to think about the relationships between these animals and the rest of the ecosystems, and I arrived to conceive this scheme. So this is a simplified version of the functioning of marine systems. Why I say simplified? Because if you take one species, for instance, the herring, it changes its trophic position through the life cycle. This herring is eaten by the arrow worms that you see on the right when it's a larva, but the adult feeds on the arrow worms. So the same species can be the prey or the predator of other species. And so knowing the life cycles is essential to understand how the ecosystems work. If I tell you what are the main predators of tuna, you might think that it's the white shark besides us. But jellyfish feeding on the eggs and larvae and juveniles of tuna probably kill much more tuna individuals when they are small than white sharks or even us. So this life cycle approach is essential to understand what is happening in the marine ecosystems. Now, we are very much attracted by the mathematical formalization of these relationships. The person who founded the theory of ecology is Charles Darwin. Darwin is entitled to have founded the theory of evolution, but Darwin didn't know genetics. Natural selection is more ecology than evolution. So Darwin explained evolution under ecological terms. And he explained in this beautiful sentence the difference between physics and biology and ecology. He used the metaphor, throw up a handful of feathers and all must fall to the ground according to definite laws. In this illustration that I generated through artificial intelligence, you can see Darwin throwing the feathers in the air. And behind him, there is Newton, who is very proud of his laws of gravitation. But then Darwin continues, but how simple is this problem compared to the action and reaction of the innumerable plants and animals which have determined in the course of centuries the proportional numbers and kinds of organisms now thriving in the immensity of the ocean. Now, Darwin, this is not exactly the sentence because he was speaking about the genesis of a forest, but it can be used also for the figure that it's above and that is representing the actions and reactions of innumerable plants and animals that make up oceanic ecosystems. And you cannot find a simple formula to describe this, and then at the pressing of a button, predict the future. So we have to deal with this high complexity and uncertainty, and we have to use the tools that are available that sometimes are not the same tools that are effective while dealing with simple problems. I showed before that the world ocean is highly connected. And so here it is, the Great Ocean Conveyor. But you can split this enormous space in subspaces that have some compactedness within their boundaries. For instance, the Mediterranean, which is the only other place on the planet where there are sites of deep water formation near the surface. And so you can see here the three cold engines that bring oxygen towards the deep of the Mediterranean Sea and bring up the nutrients, mixing the waters. The Mediterranean can be further split into sub-basins like the Tyrrhenian Sea or the Adriatic Sea. And in these basins, we can see other spaces that are highly connected by currents. So connectivity, the exploration of connectivity, allows for the identification of what I call the cells of ecosystem functioning. So the natural units of conservation and management of the marine space. If we want to take biodiversity and ecosystems into consideration. Of course, geology and physics are essential to understand these things, but then we have to put on this canvas the living world, which is regulated by abiotic drivers, but also has an impact on them. What are the dimensions of oceanic ecosystems? There are two dimensions of the sea bottom, and that's why we speak about surfaces. The seafloor is bidimensional. And then there is the third dimension of the water column. That's why the ocean is a volume. But if I sample the water column, even within the same cell of ecosystem functioning, at a geographic scale, I will see that the components of the ecosystems are not the same in each column, notwithstanding connectivity. So there is a fourth dimension, which is the geographic one, that must be added to the previous three. And if we add the pulses of phyto and then zooplankton that sustain the oceanic ecosystems, we have to add a fifth dimension, which is time. And so the ocean changes with the seasons, and we find different things in the water column according to dynamics that must be still explored completely. And here you can see again what is happening in the sediments influences the water column, and the water column influences the sediments. Then there is history. And so the seasonal fluctuations are the chronicle, but then there is the history. And here you can see three examples of history that I am familiar with, like the trophic downgrading of the Adriatic, that was the richest sea in terms of production of fish in the whole Mediterranean basin, that went through jellyfish blooms and then red tides and then mucilages, and now it's characterized by a richness that does not equal to the previous one. Now in the Adriatic, there are mucilages again, and the temperature of the sea is 30 degrees, something that never occurred in the history we know. Then there is another example of phase shift in the history of the world ocean that is exemplified by the sentence from a fish to a jellyfish ocean. With industrial fisheries, we removed most fish from the ocean, and the void left by the fish that we take out from the ocean is being filled by jellyfish. And then there is the tropicalization of the Mediterranean, and so tropical species that are entering the basin and being favored by the increases in temperature that harm the autochthonous species, and so they replace them, creating a new type of biodiversity that is not present in the recent history of the Mediterranean. So there are 6 dimensions that we have to deal with if we want to understand what is happening in the world ocean. And this calls for long-term observation strategies, because history can be seen only if we have a continuous record of what is happening. These are some of the reports I contributed to, and I will cite a sentence in Navigating the Future 4 of the European Marine Board, that says to truly progress this knowledge, European scientists, but I dare to say not only European, across a broad range of disciplines and domains, must make a quantum leap towards holistic approaches and integrated research on a scale which will help us to much better understand, protect, manage, and sustainably exploit the seas and the oceans which surround us. This is a grand challenge. And the challenge is further taken in Navigating the Future 5, where the cells of ecosystem functioning are introduced as the smallest fully connected portions of the marine environment, where biodiversity patterns and ecosystem functions depend on each other. So we have lots of data, analysis, and recommendations that led to a suite of directives by the European Commission. And here you have the history of these directives. They started focusing on species, so birds, for instance, and so charismatic species, iconic species. Then they shifted to habitats, and so the Habitats Directive. And then to Chemistry and Biogeochemistry Water Framework Directive, until with the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, the Common Fisheries Policy, and the Maritime Spatial Planning, the European Union advised to embrace the ecosystem approach in dealing with any kind of environment. This led to the European Green Deal, the mission Healthy Oceans, Seas, Coastal and Inland Waters, and then to the Nature Restoration Law, which has been approved very recently by the European Commission. I put different colors of the different directives. Unfortunately, they all remain valid together, so there are some contradictions. The shift to the ecosystem approach sometimes is not used, and people continue to speak about habitats or species. But we must understand that ecosystems are made of habitats and species, but habitats and species cannot account for ecosystems. This is the Marine Strategy Framework Directive of 2008. In this directive, the European Union advised to, well, set the target of attaining good environmental status in all European waters by 2020. Not in marine protected areas, in all European waters. The indicators of good environmental status are indicator number 1, biodiversity is maintained, so there is biodiversity. The other 10 indicators take into consideration single impacts, the alien species, the fisheries, the trophic networks, eutrophication that I prefer to call dystrophy, sea bottom integrity, hydrology, contaminants with 2 indicators, marine litter, now the plastic that is so popular, and inputs of energy into the sea. And they say these impacts must be kept under a threshold so as not to affect the functioning of ecosystems. So the pillars of good environmental status and of the European policy in dealing with the ocean are biodiversity and ecosystems. Of course, some of these measures are of geological interest, for instance, the sea bottom, and you can see here the extraction of manganese nodules from the sea bottom, or the air gun that is used in the energy to prospects looking for oil. But all the impacts of these activities have a meaning if they impact on ecosystems, and so on biodiversity and ecosystems. So if we have to attain sustainability, we have to test the state of biodiversity and ecosystems. That is the measure of the efficacy of sustainability initiatives. And this is written in this report that I participated to the writing of the European Academy's Science Advisory Council on marine sustainability. And these concepts were also proposed for a G7 meeting in Berlin, where there was a declaration about the integrity of the ocean. I recently published a paper because I was asked to write it by the journal Advances in Marine Biology about a roadmap towards a knowledge-based maritime spatial planning aimed at attaining sustainability, which is one of the goals of the United Nations. And so I identified 5 steps. One is to make the inventory of biodiversity, because we have to know what we are talking about. We named 2 million species, but the estimates are that there might be 10 million species out there. And the majority of these species are in the ocean, which is very poorly explored in terms of biodiversity. We know we invest lots of money to look for extraterrestrial life, but we didn't explore the life on this planet. And so answering the question, how many species are there on the planet and what are these species, it's not sufficient to guess a number like these 10 millions, is a priority, should be a priority. But knowing that a species exists is not enough. We must know what they do to make ecosystems function. And even the species that we know, most of them have unknown roles. So the step 2 is to understand what they do. And then we have to, the single species, and then we have to understand how they are related with each other and with the physical environment. So once we know the structure, biodiversity, we must know the functions, which is ecosystem functioning. And then we have to frame biodiversity and ecosystem functioning in a spatial-temporal context. And so we have to map the cells of ecosystem functioning and set up long-term observation strategies. After we know that, we might start planning for our activities with a knowledge-based maritime spatial planning towards sustainability. How can we sustainably manage something that is unknown to us for the most part? And that's what we are doing. We are planning without knowing, because the roadmap designs a road that has not been taken. Physics, chemistry, and geology and biogeochemistry are measured with powerful observation systems. And you see them on top of the figure represented here on the right. They tell us a lot about marine systems, but of the inanimated portion of these systems. Below, you see biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. So if you want to produce a digital twin of the ocean, you cannot do only the part that is shown above. You need to know also what is below. And so biodiversity and ecosystems. On another planet, if there were just water, that the current approach might be sufficient, but not on this planet, which is a living planet. Strange enough, in the era of biodiversity, biodiversity expertise is vanishing. So we tend to deal with these things with chemistry, biogeochemistry, molecular biology sometimes, but naming animals and animals and plants and bacteria and whatever cannot be done if we do not observe the organisms and understand what they do, what they are and what they do, and what are their relationships. Now, this is a model and a challenge towards a theory of natural history. Unfortunately, most of the variables are still unknown and are not being investigated properly. We make predictive models with set of formulas, but we do not know the relevant variables that make up the modeled systems. And like is the case of the digital twin. And this is what we are doing since decades. This situation is explained by this beautiful sentence by Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize in economics, who says, if a question is too difficult, we tend to look for an easier one, the simple problem of Newton, and pretend to have answered the difficult one, which is more or less many members of the scientific community keep doing. We need to upgrade our approaches and understand these processes that here are simply modeled with a sketch, and I challenge to build a series of equations that will predict the behavior of these innumerable plants and animals and microbes that interact with each other. So probably we need to shift to different methods to tackle these problems. Now, the European Union keeps asking for holistic approaches, and I dare to say that the scientific community is ready to accept the challenge. We know enough to be aware to decide what to do. And all these directives are asking us to do it. And so we should do it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Ferdinando. It's a great challenge at the end. Now we can open up for Q&A. So we have still, I think, more than 60 participants. I would ask those participants who are not online, there are a couple of us here who are participating more directly. Could you please type your questions if you can? You should see the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, you should be able to ask a question in the box. And then
there are no questions, but they can raise their hand and pose the questions by speaking.
Yes, sure. In the meantime, I have an observation and a question. I really liked your graphics. I really liked the lecture a lot. And these are complex relationships, and I think you've explained them beautifully. And in some senses, of course, you open the issue of how little we know about this complex system and how important it is that we do find out more. The graphics of the food chain in the oceans always show the great white shark at the end of the food chain. I'm in Nanjing at the moment, but I live in Cape Town at other times. And of course, the waters around Cape Town, particularly in the Eastern Indian Ocean side to the east of south of Cape Town, are one of the major breeding grounds of the great white shark. And obviously that does all the things that your graphics are suggesting. But actually, the real top of the food chain in that part of the world is the orca, or the killer whale. Now, admittedly, we don't get large numbers of them. When we do get them in the vicinity, the sharks tend to literally evaporate. They clearly know when the orcas are around. They're incredibly clever beasts, those orcas. And interestingly enough, you probably know this, they're only interested in the liver of the great white shark. They discard absolutely everything else, and it goes into the food chain for all those other organisms that you've shown us. But it's an interesting thing. It may only happen locally, of course, where the breeding grounds are, but definitely the killer whales are at the top of the food chain there. I see that we have...
The top of the food chain is shown in the 4 fluxes graph. It's us. And there is a human with an open mouth and eats all the rest. That is the top of the food chain.
That is very true. Now, I see there's a question from Kathy Whaler. How to get scientific communities to work together, for example, those interested in ocean mining with the bio communities. What carrots and sticks can be used?
Well,
I'll leave that one.
The carrot is money. And I have experienced several European projects where the calls were asking for holistic approaches expressly. So I assembled one with many scientists and also socioeconomists and so on. Each one was a specialist of something, and we were supposed to work together. It didn't work very well. The single scientists were interested only in their own topics, and they didn't care about what the others were doing. We are over-specialized, and it's very difficult to have familiarity with all the intricacies of the different things that are determining the functioning of the ecosystems. This is a problem because if a politician asks 100 marine scientists, what are the priorities in marine science? The politician will have 100 different answers. And each scientist will say that what is or she is doing is the most important thing. If you ask to physicists, they have two questions: particles and then astrophysics, the origin of the universe. And they are consistent with that. We are not. And that's why there are not such big projects compared to what is invested in astrophysics or in particle physics. In Italy, there is now a polemic because there was a protest about a telescope that is going to be built in a national park. This telescope is part of a project to detect asteroids that might impact on our planet and kill us all. Now, this thing happened 66 million years ago for the dinosaurs. What is the risk that we will be wiped off by an asteroid? But these guys succeeded in convincing politicians that it's worthwhile building a system like that. And the rockets to kill the asteroid. We are not convincing in delivering these messages because we are not convinced of the unicity of the message. And so we need to speak more with each other. So the sticks are being used.
Thank you.
But they keep asking for holistic approaches, and we keep being reductionistic. We split complex things into simpler things, and then we answer easy questions pretending to have answered complex questions. So we have to speak more with each other.
Thank you. Kathy represents one of the other GeoUnions, and one of our, we only meet once, twice, or three times a year virtually, but one of our objectives is to talk to each other and to understand each other a little.
Johannes Mattes.
We don't have any money.
Yes, Johannes Mattes.
Yeah. Johannes has asked another question.
I have written a paper on Darwin, arguing that he founded the theory of ecology. Of course, Darwin didn't coin the word ecology, you're right, it was Haeckel, but what Haeckel called ecology was called the economy of nature by Darwin. And the main concepts of the ecological theory, trophic cascades, ecosystems, and so on, the niche, the Red Queen hypothesis, you name it, are already present in the origin of species. So if you write me an email, I will send you that paper and maybe I will convince you. Darwin didn't found the theory of evolution because he didn't know genetics. So the theory of evolution had to be reformulated as soon as we knew more. But the ecological explanations, natural selection, are very up to date.
Thank you. Yes, both questions so far have come from people involved in our other GeoUnions. Johannes, apart from being a historian of science, is also the secretary, I think it is, of the International Association of Speleology. So he has another perspective, but it'd be good if we can get him that paper. I see there's a comment from Mahdi, which says that he's learned a lot, and so have I. But Alec Ismailzadeh has a question. I think you can
the
read
balance
it,
of ecosystem changing. If so, how? We started our history on the planet as hunters and gatherers. Then we shifted to agriculture, and we started raising cattle. In the ocean, we are still hunters and gatherers with fisheries. So we tap from natural populations, something that is impossible on land. Everything we use on land comes from agriculture. But we are tapping from marine systems industrially. And now we have depleted most of the basins of the planet. The Mediterranean is almost depleted. And now we are going fishing in other parts of the world to do the same things that we did to our seas. And what I showed, the shift from a fish ocean to a jellyfish ocean, is the result of this overexploitation. Furthermore, on land, we raise only herbivores, cows, sheep, and so on. With aquaculture, we raise carnivores, the salmon, sea bream, and so on. They are all carnivores. And we feed them with food that comes from wild fish of no commercial value. So we are feeding lions with sheep, and then we are eating the lions. And this is crazy. So this is depleting the oceanic systems even more. So if you ask me how the balance of ecosystems is changing, it's easy to understand it. I am 73 years old. When I was young, on the fish market, there were only fish that were coming from the sea in front of my hometown. If I go now to the fish market, more than half of the fish are from aquaculture, and they come from other places because there is not. So we have affected the oceanic systems. Look at the fish market, and you will see.
Yeah, I've had, of course, I think probably we all have had firsthand, records of that. I had the great pleasure of visiting a part of your part of the world on a couple of occasions, 30 to Positano, and I was quite alarmed at. Well, you couldn't see anything alive in the sea at all, apart from the wretched Medusa jellyfish.
Yes, in South Africa, they are very, very abundant. There is a friend, Mark Gibbons, who is studying these things in Cape Town. Yes, the Benguela Current is full of jellyfish. And before absolutely. It was full of fish. Who knows why?
Yeah. There is no doubt that our exploitation of marine resources in general has tipped the balance. I note, for example, that humans now, in terms of biomass, outweigh all other wild organisms by an order of magnitude. So it's simply a weight of people and the requirement to keep those people moving, and people eating more and more fish in their diets, it seems. Especially where I am here at the moment in Asia, although quite a lot of that comes from terrestrial river fish rather than from the oceans. I see my colleague in the IGU, Pankaj, has a question.
Yes, what is SDG? What
Sustainable Development Goals.
Ah, okay, yes. Well, the main impact on sustainable development goals is the impairing of the cold engines that operate the Great Ocean Conveyor. This is changing our climate. in the atmosphere and the climate in the ocean. The two are strictly connected, even if the two disciplines, the climate of the ocean and the climate of the atmosphere, are kept as separated. So what we are doing in the atmosphere is influencing the ocean, and the impact in the ocean is reverberating into the atmosphere. And this affects everything we do. There are extreme events that occur increasingly, and this affects standard development goals. But what affects the development goals more is the expectation. Now we speak about development. You have to remember that in biology, development is not unlimited. So when we are born, we are a tiny cell, and then we grow, we develop, and when we arrive at a certain size, growth stops. If it doesn't stop, it's a problem. We expect that GDP grows to the infinite. So our economic expectations are stupid. If the GDP doesn't grow and it stops growing, the economists call that stagnation. And if it decreases, it's recession. The only important thing is growth. And growth is often taken as synonym with development. There cannot be infinite growth on this planet. So if the expectation of development is the infinite growth of the economy, we will be very disappointed, because every growth determines a degrowth of something else. So every growth of the economic capital determines the degrowth of the natural capital. Do you think that we can live without the natural capital? We cannot. But in economics, this is called externalities. The destruction of nature is considered as an externality that is not taken into consideration in cost-benefit analysis. The externalities must be internalized, and then we can hope for sustainability. But if the expectation is economic growth, then we will be very disappointed by the outcomes of this expectation. As simple as that. Infinite growth is not possible. It's a law of physics. We don't need biology.
So Kathy's again come back with another question for you about the potential impacts of the warming ocean. I think we're probably already seeing some of those effects.
The main impact is the impairment of the Great Ocean Conveyor. It will not affect ecosystems and biodiversity very much, because life evolves. So life went through many impacts that are much greater than ours. And every time it evolved new solutions. So we have to be concerned with our survival and not with the survival of ecosystems of biodiversity. They can take care of themselves very easily with evolution. We will not be around if we continue in this way.
Yeah. Just to follow on from that, I noticed the paper last year in Nature that was looking at I think it's not actually the Gulf Stream, but I think it's an ocean current that runs in the North Atlantic.
It's the Gulf, it's the Gulf
significant
Stream.
signs of weakening.
Yes, the melting of polar ice liberates fresh water, cold fresh water. Cold fresh water floats over marine water, goes against the Gulf current and stops it. And so the mitigation of the Gulf current on the European climate is impaired. This affects our economy a lot. And there are disasters already happening in Germany, in England, and so on, in Italy too. There is another question about time and history. The difference is, it's the same difference that, no, I meant history. And I made 3 examples of the history of the systems. So one thing is understanding the seasonal fluctuations during a year cycle. Another thing is understanding the evolution of ecosystems in the long term. So short term, long term. We do not have programs that are sustained for 20, 40, 50 years, for the ocean at least, okay? We have a beautiful observation system for the atmosphere. The models that predict the weather take into account the measures of this system with satellites and meteorological stations and so on. The models have been built according to the history of climate, and they are fed continuously with new data. Without the new data, you cannot predict the weather. In a very short time, the models do not work anymore. We don't have such a system for biodiversity and ecosystems, but we pretend to predict the future of biodiversity and ecosystems without the data. So we need to know the present and the history of our systems. And the difference is between the chronicle and history. Our projects are always short-term, and so we understand bits of this history. We need to link all these observations in a temporal framework. And this will help us in understanding the history of the systems. I don't see any other questions.
I have a question. I've seen that Michael has his connection down, so.
He disappeared, but ask the question.
Sorry, Michael is calling me.
Ah, okay.
Michael?
Sure. Giuliano, my connection has gone down. There's an internet problem here. Are you able to take over as chair?
Okay.
Sorry, it may well come back. It's trying to connect, but it's not. I don't know what's gone wrong. It's
okay.
Stopped now.
So I was going to make a question to Ferdinando.
We should finish in.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I lost my screen. Yes. No, sorry, because I didn't find a way to write a question, so I will do it directly.
Go ahead.
So I am a technologist in the sense that I'm belonging to the Radio Scientific Union, and we studied the fact and what we can construct with the use of radio waves, studying the Earth in some. So I'm wondering how these two worlds could come together, because I am first of all, I would say that I enjoyed very much your nice presentation, great presentation, and so I thank you for what you showed to us. And I'm wondering how these two worlds of technology and the understanding of these cycles, ecosystems, could get together. Do you feel the need for some kind of help from technology to understand these ecosystems that I think are very complicated systems?
Technology is not an help, is essential. So we can attain sustainability only if we develop sustainable technologies. So you have the solutions, okay? But the ecologists have the knowledge to assess the efficacy of solutions that you are proposing. So, as I said, the solutions, if they lead to improvement in biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, are effective. If they don't, they are not game changers. If they lead to a deterioration of biodiversity and ecosystems, they are negative. So you cannot develop your technologies without us. Usually this is not the case. So we think that with technologies we can solve all the problems, which is probably true, but we need to frame the solutions into a biodiversity and ecosystem framework, because sustainability means this.
Yes,
So
I agree.
if I have a solution without knowing what are its impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems, and we are part and we depend on biodiversity and ecosystems, there is the concept of One Health. Our health depends on the health of biodiversity and ecosystems. So, okay, you have a solution. Let's test it and see what happens. And while you are developing your technologies, we should work together because we are the devil's advocates, okay? We will find strange things and ask you questions, okay? If you propose nuclear power plants, I will ask you, where are you going to store the rejects of the nuclear power plants?
But
And
my
if your
question
question, if you don't have an answer, I'm sorry, I don't buy your technology, okay?
No, but my question was oriented mostly to understand how we could get a procedure, a way to use technology for reaching your goals. In the sense, use technology
we have to work together
to better understand the cycles of marine life, for instance.
This is linked to the interaction between the two communities. Now, we have beautiful technologies to measure geology, chemistry, physics. We have nothing on biology and ecology. So we need these instruments. Of course, we cannot develop them. The technologists should be entitled to do that, okay? But then it's the question of Daniel Kahneman. I say we have to monitor the environment, but what variables are we monitoring? And if you keep proposing technologies that measure abiotic factors and don't take into consideration the living component of the system, then it's not so useful. But I cannot invent a technology to do these things. The technologists must do it. So you are essential. We have the problems, you have the solutions. But then we are entitled to test the solutions and say if they are really solutions or not.
Yeah, you're right. And I think the first problem is to understand each other, in the sense we don't know the problems that we could solve with our technology. And I think this kind of webinars, from my point of view, are very interesting just to understand which are the problems in which we could have an impact. So thank you again for your presentation. It was very exciting to me. Yeah.
Thanks for your interest and for the invitation, of course. It's a great honor.
I think that comment hits the nail absolutely on the head. My apologies to you all. My connection went down about 5 minutes ago. It might still be struggling. I hope you can hear me. If not,
yes, we do.
I want to thank good. I want to thank you, Ferdinando, for a really entertaining and actually quite provocative lecture that's raised all kinds of issues in our minds, and indeed the need for us to connect. The marine world is connected in complex ways. We all ourselves as scientists need to connect to try and resolve the kind of problems we've got ourselves into as a species, particularly with regard to the oceans. We have an international decade of the oceans, as well as the International Decade for Science for Sustainable Development. And we hope very much that our unions, the GeoUnions in particular, are participating fully in those. So I see no further questions. And with that, I'll close the session to thank you once again, and to all the participants. We will resume the series again in 2 months' time exactly, on whatever the second Tuesday of November is. We have a very exciting speaker on a different topic, again, to help us make some of these connections that we believe are so important. So with that, it's a good night from me. I'm sure it's good afternoon for some of you, and maybe even good evening. But thank you so much for your participation. It's greatly appreciated. And
thanks
to Inga, who as amanuensis was keeping the whole thing together technically. Thank you very much.